In the vast sunburnt lands of Australia, one of the country's most iconic animals, the dingo, faces a silent threat. It's not a predator, a disease, or a natural disaster, but something far more sinister: 1080 poison. This deadly chemical, often used as a form of pest control, has been deployed across Australia for decades, aimed at controlling native species such as dingoes. But the more we learn about 1080, the more we realise how devastating it is, not just to dingoes, but to entire ecosystems. 1080, or sodium fluoroacetate, is a powerful, highly toxic poison used by governments and landowners across Australia to kill animals such as foxes, rabbits, and dingoes. The poison is usually delivered in the form of a bait, often laced in meat or grains, and dropped over large areas by planes, by hand, or by helicopters. When an animal consumes 1080, the poison works quickly, interfering with the animal's cellular process, shutting down their central nervous system. It causes rapid heart failure, convulsions, and in the case of dingoes, a slow and agonizing death. But it's not just dingoes at risk. The danger of 1080 lies in its non-discriminatory nature. While it's primarily used to target certain species, it doesn't know the difference between a dingo and a non-target species, or even a domestic dog. When an animal ingests 1080, it doesn't just suffer in silence. The poison attacks the mitochondria of the cells, preventing energy production. As a result, organs fail and the heart stops, and the animal dies in excruciating pain. In some cases, it can take up to 24 hours for an animal to die after ingesting the poison, making it one of the most horrific and inhumane ways to die in the wild. While it's intended to target pests, pets, especially dogs, are at a great risk if they encounter 1080 baits. The consequences are devastating. Every year, pets are poisoned accidentally when they ingest these baits, leading to death or severe organ damage. And for dingoes, who often scavenge for food in the wild, this presents an ongoing and ever-present threat. And these baits are indiscriminate, because despite claims that 1080 is less harmful to native marsupials, research from as far back as 1982 has shown us that marsupials have suffered horrific deaths at the hand of 1080. The tiger quoll, eastern quoll, and long-nosed potteroo are all listed as threatened under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and have all been shown to be highly susceptible to 1080 poisoning. Almost 20 years ago, the Threatened Species Scientific Committee's advice to the Minister for the Environment and Heritage stated that in relation to the tiger quoll, research at 2 study sites in southern New South Wales and 1 in Victoria indicated local declines in the order of 60 to 100% over the last 5 years. The research is suggesting that aerial baiting for dingoes with 1080 poison to be the primary cause of these localised population declines and extinctions. A reality that few people seem to acknowledge is the fact that 1080 baiting is also extremely ineffective. A recent study that tracked baits showed us that dingoes made up just 1% of the animals that consumed the poison. This approach doesn't just harm dingoes, it disrupts the entire ecosystem. Without dingoes to control populations, invasive species like rabbits and foxes multiply unchecked. These animals damage the environment, overgraze native vegetation, and compete with other species for food and habitat. The very ecosystem that the 1080 poison was meant to protect becomes further destabilised. The use of 1080 is one of the most controversial wildlife management practices in Australia. The poison is banned in nearly every single country except for Australia and New Zealand. While it's often justified as a necessary tool for controlling pest species, the toll it takes on non-target wildlife and even the ecosystem as a whole is undeniable. The risks to Australia's biodiversity are profound. We need to find better, more humane ways to manage wildlife. Many people mistakenly believe that native animals in Australia are immune to 1080 poison because it's derived from native plants, specifically the Glen Canyon wattle, which produces naturally occurring fluoroacetate. This misconception has been widely circulated, giving the false impression that the Australian wildlife has evolved to tolerate 1080. However, this is a dangerous myth. In reality, 1080 is highly toxic to a wide range of native species. Government bodies have used it to deliberately target and kill native animals like paddy melons in Tasmania, where these small marsupials are poisoned as part of pest control efforts. The fact is, many native species, including paddy melons, are just as vulnerable to 1080 as introduced animals like rabbits and foxes. This reinforces the urgent need for a more humane and targeted approach to wildlife management, one that does not rely on indiscriminate poison that harms Australia's native fauna. Instead of relying on poison that wreaks havoc on wildlife, we should be focusing on methods that respect the balance of nature and allow for the protection of both farmers' livelihoods and the preservation of Australia's unique wildlife. The continued use of 1080 poison is not just a threat to dingoes, but to entire ecosystems. It's time we take a stand, not just for dingoes, but for all of the creatures who call this land home. It's time to say enough and to call for a ban on 1080 poison.